Welcome, everybody, to the Puro Wrestling Academy. Now, some podcasts, they have debut editions, inaugural episodes, if you will. But here at the Academy, it's our grand opening. And I am your co-host, Ray Russell. And as you all know, every good Academy needs an equally as good educator. But here on the WrestleCopia brand, we don't just settle for good. Now do we? I wanted great. And I went out and got us just that. And with that, I welcome on perhaps the most well-versed Japanese wrestling historian in the Western world. I have personally dubbed him the Professor of Puroresu. Get ready as he prepares to break the language barrier to inform and entertain us all. And now, please welcome the Dean of the Puro Wrestling Academy. I welcome on your host, Mr. Dan Ginnetty. Dan, so good to have you here.
Thanks, Ray, for that introduction. And to all you listeners, class is in session.
Oh, my. Already.
I already got my tagline.
I love it. Well, welcome to the show, Dan. It's your show here, the Puro Wrestling Academy. I was so happy when I pitched this idea at you that you were on board.
No, I would really appreciated the offer. It kind of came out of nowhere, but as we discussed on the forum before this, I had done something a little similar to this way back in the past, and I'll be drawing on some of that experience to move forward with the podcast.
Oh, yeah, and we're going to get into exactly what you're referring to here in just a couple of minutes, but it's so great to finally get this thing going. Now, a couple months in the making, but as a preparer and a researcher myself, I can respect your organization and preparation skills. It's good to know once this thing gets going, which it has now, that we've got basically an unlimited amount of topics that we can discuss right at our fingertips.
Yeah, we can go in a million different directions. We have a general idea how we want to progress through the timeline, but as the feedback comes from the listeners, we can redirect and take U-turns or stop and do deep dives. There's a million different ways to do this, and we're going to cater this to what the listeners want to hear.
I love that idea. As this episode, though, guys, it's sort of a get-to-know-you type of episode, get-to-know-Dan type of episode. Everybody that listens to WrestleCopia at least should know who I am by now. But for those new listeners out there who are always into the Japanese wrestling scene, of course, I am Ray Russell, the creator of the WrestleCopia brand. But Dan, it's great to have you here. We're going to talk a little bit about your background in the world of wrestling, and we're going to talk about what our plans are here for this show.
Okay, well, I became a wrestling fan in, late 1978, maybe 1979, that time frame. Bob Backlund was the champion. When I grew up, I lived in the Boston area, so I was just getting the WWF broadcast at the time. And I watched that all the way until I got cable in 1985, and then kind of the whole world opened up. Really opened up for the Japanese part was with the video store opening in my town. There was a best of WWF series in the old days, and one of those tapes had a match between Cobra and Black Tiger.
Oh, yeah.
Cobra was a Japanese wrestler, George Takano. I do remember seeing Tiger Mask on television way back in 81 or 82. Mm-hmm. Masa Saito as well, but I really didn't see him as a Japanese wrestler. I saw him more as an American version of what a Japanese wrestler is. Throwing the salt, wearing the wooden shoes, very stereotypical, not what you would understand Japanese wrestling to be like.
Right.
One other videotape that I got to see that really blew me away was an AWA series of videotapes from the mid-'80s, and one of them had Jumbo Tsuruta against Rick Martel. I knew who Rick Martel was, but I had never seen Jumbo before, and he really impressed me because he seemed to have an understanding of how to play to an audience, which a lot of the Japanese wrestlers, at least, were doing in a different way. So he really impressed me and got me more interested in it.
You know, Dan, and I'm sure you are aware of this, they sent a lot of the guys, the Japanese guys, over here early on in their infancy in the world of professional wrestling to learn the American way before they came back over there and became huge stars over in Japan, like Tenryu, just to name one, but so many other. Jumbo was over here some. Lots of guys traveled here before they got over there.
It started with the very first one, Riki Dozan. He was in a couple of shows in 1952. And as soon as that was over, just a short tour in Japan, he went to train in America and Hawaii and California to season himself before he would come back to Japan and be the superstar he became. You already mentioned Jumbo getting trained in Amarillo with the Funks, Tenryu also. And Tenryu had a long run in the States for quite a few years, from 76 to 81. He spent more time in the States than he did in Japan. It's part of the seasoning. Anything from Kawada, Hashimoto, Chono. We all know Great Muta or Keiji Muto spend time. It's an important part of the development, and it also gives them a chance to kind of refresh, where they'll go to the United States and they will, quote, return to Japan with a new move or maybe a different gimmick. And sometimes that's all it takes to put them over, or in the fans' eyes, they now can accept them as an elevated status from before, where they might have been a young boy or a mid-carder. They come back with a new gimmick. Now they're willing to accept him as a main eventer.
You know, you talked about, I think it was Best of the WWF Volume 1, actually, that has the Cobra Black Tiger match on it, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember watching that for the first time myself back in the 80s, and I was blown away with the action, because we didn't have anything like that here in the United States. The closest thing we ever got was maybe earlier Dynamite Kid, and he really wasn't doing that in the WWF at that point in time. So I guess, you know, my question is, we know that you've seen some of the talent here on videotape, like Cobra, like Jumbo Shruda. When did you realize that, hey, there's a whole lot more of this out there that I can acquire?
It was the very early 90s with the advent of the internet. I was on the internet about 1991, early 1991. I had a friend who was in college. They had computer labs and they had the internet, and I was finding message boards and wrestling websites when there weren't that many websites in total.
Right.
I also got exposed or introduced to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, and I believe it was a magazine. I wish I could remember the name of it. It was not an Aftermag, but it was a much cheaper version of a wrestling magazine in 1991, maybe 92. And they actually had ads for people selling videotapes. And I ended up getting some comps of Bruiser Brody, Flair, and the Road Warriors. And I got them, and they were full of Japanese matches. And I was like, who are these guys? And as I'm watching them, I didn't know who any of them were, or almost any of them. I knew Jumbo. I knew Tenryu. He had spent time in the NWA as part of the six-man championships. WrestleMania 6, I think he was with Koji Kitao. So I knew he existed, but I hadn't seen a lot of his work. But then I saw a lot of other wrestlers. I saw Riki Choshu, and I didn't have to understand Japanese to know that that guy had just a ton of charisma, and the fans went crazy for him. So in 1992, it kind of opened my eyes that this whole world existed, and to some degree, even tape trading existed. I didn't even really know that existed until then. So through that process, and obviously the Wrestling Observer, and to some degree the Torch, because they had a really nice section that just covered the Japanese wrestling TV and had folks that would go in-depth commentary on some of the matches.
Right.
That's when it really exposed and opened up the whole new world for me.
Yeah, I just think about some of the matches I saw renting videotapes, so much like yourself. And then I think, obviously the Great Muta popped up in the NWA. How awesome was he? And then Jushin Liger, not too long after that, in 91, I was blown away what was going on before my eyes. And then, WCW busted out a couple of those, what they call Japan Super shows there on pay-per-view. And I grabbed those as well. I rented got those on pay-per-view. And I was just blown away with the talent over there, Hiroshi Hase and on down the line. Lots of great matches and stuff. They picked some pretty damn good matches to throw on there and really just give me a good taste of what was going on over there. And I was wondering, how the hell do I get a hold of more of this? And it wasn't really for me until 1995 that and I don't know if it was an After Mag or some kind of a magazine. They were selling everybody's going to groan. You'll probably roll your eyes at this, Stan, but they were selling the IWA King of the Deathmatch tournament. and I was reading the Exploding Barbed Wire and I was like, who are they really doing this? The Thumbtacks and Cactus Jack and Terry Funk, who I knew very well. And I purchased that tape through there, but then it was like, there's a whole new world out here. And then obviously RF Video came along not too long after that, and I was grabbing all sorts of things left and right. But it wasn't until 95 that I realized I could find a way to get hold of some of the other, actual promotions over there.
Yeah, it was pretty similar to how I approached it. We did have the advantage living near Boston that there are Japanese grocery stores, and they also, several of them had videos. They would somehow, and I don't know the legality of it, but they had popular television shows from Japan recorded on VHS, and then they would be shipped to the Japanese markets in the United States. And you could rent them like you would rent any commercial video, but this is obviously just a dub off TV. And that's how I was able to keep up with it. Somewhere in 96 is when we started getting them regularly. You had already mentioned RF video. My friend and I started going to some ECW shows in Revere. It was a Dog Track, I think it was. But RF had a big table, and he was selling, at the time, it was just VHS tapes. DVDs weren't even out yet. We got our fair share from that, and there's a whole other world of tape trading that we could expand into, and we all know the major players in that, and I certainly took advantage of that and spent a ton of money on like third generation copies
right.
of TV because that's all we knew. And it wasn't until years later that I really tried to find the source, like with a first gen copy or a master.
Wow. And then look at you today.
Yeah, it's a long time coming, 30 years later. And I've got a sizable collection, and I'm trying to get it digitized just so the tapes don't get destroyed over time.
Right.
And I've got a lot to watch. I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to watch all of it, but I've watched so much of it, a ton of it, and there's a lot to enjoy. And it's kind of an acquired taste. It's like drinking red wine for the first time. It may not seem like it's great, but if you just give it a chance, you'll be able to appreciate the qualities of it. Japanese wrestling is just like regular wrestling, except the angles are a little bit toned down. They don't do 20-minute interviews and 3-minute matches. They tell the story in the ring like they used to in the old days in America.
Well, let's talk about that acquired taste for just a moment, because we talked about this off air before. And I told you, the first couple times I watched Japanese wrestling with Japanese commentary, it was a little hard for me to get past that. I was watching the matches, but there was all this, obviously, foreign language going on in my ears, and it was hard to tone that out and try to enjoy the match, if that's what you want to call it. But as time progressed, the matches were just so good that you learn to just kind of tune it out. But I really don't want to have to do that. And that's kind of what you're here for, is to add context to all of this. So I know there's some people out there that say they can't watch Japanese wrestling simply because of the commentary, not because it's Japanese specifically, but because there's no English commentary for them to understand what's going on. And I feel like you here being able to add context to everything going on behind the scenes and in the ring, it's really going to turn on a whole new world to a lot of people out there that have been waiting for something like this.
Well, I'm excited to be able to offer it to you. And just so that everyone out there is aware, I have been doing this for over 20 years already.
In fact, let's talk your experience, your past history here in providing such things to the people. Several years ago, you had your own TV program.
We sure did. I had a TV program with a good friend of mine who was also a big-time wrestling fan. He had some bit of performances on a local wrestling talk show where he would attempt to talk about Japanese wrestling, and the host of the show said, "Be quiet, no one cares about that stuff." And in 1998, he decided to start his own show. I was living 2 states away. I had no idea he was doing it, but he was going solo with it, airing matches and doing his own color commentary and play-by-play at the same time. I happened to be home visiting my parents and turned on public access TV, and I saw it, and then I knew who it was. And I talked to him about it, and in early 2000, we started doing the show together. And it was a 2-hour show. We did it almost every single week for 6 years.
Wow.
And
I didn't realize it went on for that long.
Yeah, I was on the show from March 2000, and I think our last regular episodes were in the middle of 2006.
Wow, okay.
Now, there were some missed shows in there. It wasn't every single week, but we had about 200 total episodes, and they were 2 hours long, and it was nothing but Japanese wrestling. And we'd also have talking segments going over the Japanese wrestling news using newsletters. And by the early 2000s, there were a bunch of internet sources. So you could kind of pick the sources that made more sense, believe it or not, some of the people that talk about Japanese wrestling in the newsletters aren't always accurate.
Wow. Okay.
So it's nice to get
somebody not accurate in the wrestling world.
I know, shocking. Well, they would say things that were crazy, and I'm not going to bring up names. There's no reason to rehash it, but some of the things were just foolish. And when I read it, I said, well, that doesn't even make sense. And of course, it didn't happen the way. It was just probably a problem with translation.
Okay.
But it's nice to get news from multiple different sources because they are all shooting around the target. You can kind of figure out what the truth is somewhere in the middle. So we would cover news, but we'd mostly cover classic matches. And when we were doing it, no one else was doing it. So we weren't picking 3-star matches. We were picking the best of the best of the best. All these match of the year, classic matches, and said, I can't wait to do this one. I can't wait to do that one. So I feel like we ran through every single classic match from all the way back in the 1960s through, I guess, say 2006.
Okay, wow.
One of the other things we had a chance to do, which was really fun, is when they were starting to release commercial DVDs in Japan, they would release the G1 Climax tournament in its entirety on like a 4-disc set. And we took the time and we would have like multiple episodes dedicated to just the G1 Climax tournament. And you could cover the entire tournament in order. And that gave us a chance to talk about, who's going to win this. And you can almost handicap it like they do with football playoffs or baseball playoffs. So you got to experience Japanese wrestling in a slightly different light there because it was match into match into match, all from one tournament. Or a feud. We could cover a feud between Tatsumi Fujinami and Riki Choshu, and we'd have all 15 matches of them on tape. So we would go in order and be able to talk about it because the good feuds, they build a story within the matches. Tiger Mask versus Dynamite Kid, which once upon a time was the greatest thing ever. Then it turned into we hate Tiger Mask. I don't know how the internet community feels about him now, but if you watch the whole feud in order, the matches build a story. There's a story within it, and we got to cover that on the show, and it's really fun, and I'm more than willing to reenact that and re-experience it through different eyes now. I'm a little bit older now, so hopefully I'll be able to pick up more info from it.
Yeah, a little older, a little wiser. So this, needless to say, is not your first rodeo in educating the Western world on Japanese professional wrestling. You did it for 6 years. I didn't even realize it was that long. That's amazing. And of course, you talked about it a little earlier. I don't know what the legalities were there, but I can imagine. And I lived in that area and flipped around on my local cable, and that it would have blown me away. My mind would have been blown that I had this to watch, and not just watch, but actually hear people speak the language that I know, which is English, and kind of explain everything to me on top of watching the crazy, the entire G1 Climax. It's just amazing.
It was so weird because we were something of local celebrities. After we taped the show, this is so funny. We would go to a local restaurant. It was, I can't remember what it was. It doesn't matter. Like a 99 restaurant. And we just be having lunch after taping a show in the morning. And one time there was a guy across from us because we were at the bar. He was on the other end of the bar and he was staring at us, like staring right through us.
Wow.
And I'm eating my food, noticing he's staring. It's like, what is this guy's deal? Because he looked a little rough. And I told my friend, the great Riki, which is his name for the show, I said, I think something's going to happen here. So I'm like getting ready to defend myself. He gets up and he walks over and he walks up to us, and I turn really slow and he goes, I just want to let you know that I love your show. And it's so much fun to watch that stuff. And I was like, oh, thanks.
Didn't see that coming, huh?
No, we've signed autographs before. It is truly the strangest thing when you're on public access, your local public access, and people in town recognize you. And several of them said, I never even knew Japanese wrestling existed, but now I'm totally into it. One of our best fans, Scott Kane, is now wrestling for Taka's independent promotion in Japan right now. And we were like the motivating factor. We introduced him to Japanese wrestling, and now he is wrestling in Japan.
That's pretty damn cool, man. Learning something new every couple minutes here on the show already. We haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. But speaking of the good stuff, guys, we're going to take a brief break right now. And when we return, it's going to be all about the information in regards to what you can expect here on the program. We got to know Dan just a little bit here. We're going to get to know him each and every week here on the program. But Up next, after this break, we're going to talk all about what this show is about and what it can be about right after this. Hey guys, Ray Russell here of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and everywhere your podcast streaming needs are met, inviting you all to check out all of the great shows here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including this right here, of course, the Puro Wrestling Academy, but also the Wrestling Memory Grenade, going back in time, currently reliving the Hulkamania era of 1988 in the World Wrestling Federation. Also, check out the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. 3 projects going on right now over there, including Georgia 1981 with Jamie Ward, Memphis 1985 with Gene Jackson, and the UWF in 1986 with Roman Gomez. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop, plus Barry Rose and Captain Nick Massey's Glory Days Grapple Concast, and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, once again located over at WrestleCopia.com. And be sure to follow me on social media. You can find us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade, and subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And last but not least, you're going to want to give it a try talking about the $5 all access tier over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts for just $5, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for 3 different podcasts, including the Wrestling Memory Grenade, Regional Wrestling, and the Monday Warfare Podcast. You'll also get early access to many of the podcasts here on WrestleCopia, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. In fact, the Puro Wrestling Academy, episode 0 here, dropping 2 weeks early for patrons only. You'll also get enhanced versions of the earliest episodes of The Grenade Show covering the 1989 NWA project. Includes enhanced sound quality, plus new content and conversation never heard before. But that's still not all. You also get digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure, random bonus video drops, and of course, our Patreon exclusive watch-along series, covering many past WWF and WCW events, and up right now, our very first WrestleCopia brand videocast. Join me, Ray Russell, and co-host Gene Jackson as we go back in time to watch Grunt, the wrestling movie, and you guys can go there right now on Patreon and watch along with us. And you get all of that for the low price of just $5. No subscription, cancel anytime, give it a try for a month. I think you'll like all of the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into keeping the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come. Hey guys, you're invited to join us April 20th, Orlando, Florida at the fabulous Rosen Center Hotel for Barry Rose and Captain Nick Massey's Glory Days Grapple Con. Tickets available right now at eventbrite.com. It's a full day of events, meet and greet with dozens of your favorite wrestling superstars, both past and present. It all kicks off 10:30 in the morning. Ron Simmons, a special 1-hour Q&A session. Damn! Then from there, meet and greet all of the great superstars in attendance. Get your pictures, get your autographs, and spend some time. Have some conversations. Make a memory. Before we head off to the Legends of World Class reunion panel, hosted by former announcer Mark Lawrence. Just some of the names on the panel include Brian Adias, Al Perez, the One-Man Gang, Missy Hyatt, and Jack Victory. They're going to go back in time and discuss their time in the world-class territory. Then from there, late in the evening, it's a shot of Jack with Jack Victory. So come on in, stop by, have a good time, have some drinks, and most assuredly, have quite a few laughs as well. Again, mark your calendars, April 20th, Orlando, Florida, the Rosen Center Hotel. It's the Glory Days Grapple Con. Get your tickets today over at eventbrite.com. All right, guys, and welcome back to the grand opening of the Puro Wrestling Academy. I am joined by the Professor of Puroresu himself, Mr. Dan Ginnetty. Welcome back from the break.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be back.
Well, we are happy that you are here. For all of us, not just the people listening, but I am happy to have you here. And we talked a little bit about your background, how you got started, some of the early matches you saw that really got you invested, not just into wrestling, but specifically Japanese wrestling. And of course, your time discovering new videos and new ways to collect said videos. But now we're going to talk about some of the other information you have hidden behind the closed vault of the mansion that is the Ginnetty world. You have exposed me to all sorts of new information, and which I am grateful for, because as anybody who's listened to any of my other shows know, I love to do research. I love to learn about the history of the business as a whole, including in Japan. And man, you have a little bit of everything. I wanted you to kind of share with the people out there just some of the things that you're able to discuss here.
Well, I've got a lot of information available at hand. I have been researching this stuff almost from the beginning when I first started watching it. So over 30 years, I've been researching like the history of wrestling, the old time stuff. I've used a bunch of different sources, some of them on the internet. I've been translating websites that are Japanese wrestling fan websites. And I've got a huge collection of magazines that I'm able to translate to some degree. Most of it is coming from the magazines. Now there's Japanese Wikipedia, but I wanted to get into the history of how the wrestling was formed. How did it all start in Japan? There were wrestlers from Japan that became wrestlers in America but stayed there. It was Riki Dozan who started the promotion and started getting popular in Japan and running a federation in Japan. And when I think about the history of Japanese wrestling, there's several angles you can attach it from. You can look at who the champions were, where the good matches were, but they're businesses in the end. So I thought it would be of some value to be aware of the business aspect. Who was making more money? Which promotions had higher ratings? Who was drawing more money to the house shows? Then beyond that, you're also looking at who's having better quality matches. So I'm just trying to see how many different angles I can look at a promotion from in order to glean knowledge from it, to get a better understanding. And over time, I would meet or interact with Japanese wrestling fans in Japan, whether it was trading footage or just communicating. And I was able to get a lot of insight from the people that were experiencing it in the 80s, living there, watching it every week. They were able to give me some of the background for the angles, even though they're not as prevalent as they are in the United States. They did technically do angles, not very many. And it was nice to get that point of view from someone who actually grew up watching it.
Right. I was going to say, when an angle actually took place in Japan, here in the States, like I think I told you this before, it's great to see that, there's some sort of an angle going down. You can read that much into what's happening, but we still don't know what they're saying. And I know you told me that you were able to speak with people and kind of get an idea and understanding of what the storyline is being told. And that's what really interested me in that. But you also taught yourself some Japanese. And like you said, you've even spoken with many Japanese fans over the years. Some have come and gone, but throughout that time when you were chatting with them, they translated a lot of things for you. And that's how you kind of picked up on things. So I think it's amazing that you used everything available to you to, again, continue to study the history of the business over there.
Yeah, wrestling research or any research in general, that is not a solitary job. You are collaborating with multiple people, multiple sources all the time. Nobody knows everything. No one person knows everything. So I'm always on the hunt for somebody who has knowledge, has information, or access to information that I don't have. All of it to kind of round out the experience or round out my knowledge base of wrestling. I did teach myself, there are two, I'd call them alphabets in the Japanese language, hiragana and katakana. They are very simple figures, and I know how to translate them. I could see them. The easiest way was in the magazines. You'd see a picture of Hulk Hogan, and then there would be this weird squiggly writing underneath it. Well, I know it's supposed to say Hulk Hogan. And then when I started studying it and took like a CD that had a class on hiragana and katakana, I was able to translate and say, okay, I see where the sounds are. So that I can read. And the Japanese wrestling magazines had a ton of that in there. It's not all kanji. Kanji is the figures that have a million different strokes in this way, that way. Those are really hard to translate. I only memorize them based on the wrestlers' names. When you see like Takada or Koshinaka or Nakamura, you see Naka, Naka, Naka enough times, you go, oh, that symbol must mean Naka. You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
well, I got to say, man, I respect the hell out of you for you're not just learning an entire, history of a specific type of wrestling, professional wrestling, but you've went the extra mile and tried to study as best you could. The language to a degree, or at least, reading certain things certain ways to help you. I mean, it's amazing because I don't know that I could take it that far, but it's totally awesome, man.
Well, it was my major hobby, so I devoted a lot of time to it. And what prompted it was I had these old magazines I was able to get from Japan, basically a Japanese version of eBay. It's called Yahoo Auctions. And I was getting boxes and boxes of old magazines way back 20 years ago when they were cheap. And I'd be looking through them, and I noticed something that looked like a page that had TV listings for the actual shows. Now, this is back before I had complete season sets for virtually everything. So this was all like holy grail stuff. Like now I know what aired on the New Japan Weekly show for September 18th, 1985.
Yeah.
And that's what really prompted me, because I could see the hiragana and katakana. And I said, I need to figure out what this says. And sometimes I would have a TV episode to match it up against, and that helped too. But that's what really prompted me to learn how to learn those two languages, or the two styles of writing, because that let me translate what the TV listings are. And I felt like now I'm a little bit closer to what a Japanese wrestling fan living in Japan would have experienced, because now I know what they got to watch that week on TV.
Well, that's quite a lot to put together. But again, you've had decades of experience and decades of time to learn all of this stuff. But I'm just amazed at how deep, you go to, really present us. And that's why you're here, Dan. You're the only name on my list to do this show. If you had said no, we wouldn't be having this show right now. And that's the truth. So I am so grateful that we got you here to really educate everyone, including myself, on even the little things. But really, your information goes so far back and it's so deep. I can't wait until we get into some of the early things, some of the early back, as you said, business aspect, the stories behind the scenes that people may not even know about here in the United States, because shenanigans went on over there as well, people. And some of them are pretty damn interesting. We talked about Inoki maybe trying to do an early overthrow. A lot of people don't know about that. And I'm sure I don't know half the full story, certainly not as much as you probably do about it. But you have all of that. You have, again, full seasons of TV to discuss, not just in video form, but written down all this transcript stuff as far as TV ratings. You have TV ratings for certain periods in time over there. And I'm not just talking last year or 10 years ago. I mean, you got TV ratings going back to what, the 1970s at least? Something like that, right?
Yeah, there was a magazine, and that's the great thing about Japan. They will release so many different magazines. There's a magazine just devoted to Japanese wrestling television broadcast. And it talks about all the different major matches and the ratings for some of the big shows like Inoki versus Ali. It'll have the ratings for the old Riki Dozan matches. Before he had a regular weekly television show, it would be a few shows a year would be broadcast on live TV. And some of them, one of them, the claim is it did a rating of 86%. 86% of the population that had televisions were watching Riki Dozan wrestle. I believe it was the Destroyer. And we'll get into all of that. That was one of the other things in these weekly pro or weekly gong magazines from the early to mid 80s. On that same page that had the TV listings, I saw numbers in the bottom of the box. If I'm looking and reading what the TV matches are supposed to be for September 18th, at the bottom of that box, you'd see September 11th, squiggle that I couldn't read, and then it would be 10.1%. Well, I eventually translated that, and it was Nielsen. So they actually had the ratings in the weekly magazines.
Wow, okay.
And there are other matches, and there's other sources of information that would give like an average rating for, say, the All Japan television show for the year of 1979. There are sources that will have that generic information, maybe not week to week, but overall. And I think that helps tell the story about the promotion's health. Because if you don't already know, in Japan, New Japan was being bankrolled by TV Asahi. And they were paying New Japan money to provide them a weekly television show for their TV station. Same thing with Nippon TV with All Japan.
Right. And so, I did not know that to that degree, both companies had that going on. Actually, Bob Roop mentioned that on his podcast, talking about the both TV channels. I guess you would call it sponsoring the wrestling companies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's crazy. I wasn't aware of that, at least not to the degree that it was going on. It was actually Bob Roop who opened my eyes to that on his podcast. So very cool. I'm happy that somebody backed it up here. I'm happy you backed it up here.
Well, I'm glad I can back up Bob Roop, of all people. A legend in wrestling. I remember Bob Roop from the olden times when I was watching in the early 80s. I remember him from one of the Battle of the Belts shows from Florida. That was the first time I saw Florida wrestling, was in February of 1986, and I seem to recall him being on one of those shows. I think it lets you experience the world of Japanese wrestling from a slightly different point of view when you have a familiarity or an awareness of the business performance of the promotion.
Right.
I mean, we can all just rely on, they've got the good matches because these guys have the funks, or these guys have the Duel of the Butcher, or this promotion has Stan Hansen. So we can be selfish and like the matches that are good, which we all do. But there's more of a story to tell if you have that information available to you, and the ratings, the business performance, and the development of wrestlers. There was a promotion, New Japan popularized junior heavyweight wrestling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They actually gave it time on television. Now, granted, they had a great talent in Tatsumi Fujinami, but it still takes someone to push them. And you can have the best wrestler in the world, but if they're not getting TV time on a weekly TV show, no one's going to know about it. And there's so many things we can talk about with the development and, quote, the battle between All Japan and New Japan, and to some degree Kokusai or IWE. There's just a lot of story to tell, and we can cover it all the way from 1951 all the way up as far as the listeners want to go. I've got all that information. The 90s is weird for me to talk about wrestling history because I was watching it.
Right.
I was already in it.
A little different. Right. Yeah.
So my perception is skewed and weird because I was in the middle of it, experiencing it. So it doesn't possess maybe the gravity that the stuff from the 60s and 70s does to me. Right. But if I talk about it, I'm going to be talking about it as just someone who was watching every week.
Yeah, first-hand experience, and there's probably some biasness in there a little bit as well. I mean, at least that's how it works for me on the other shows.
We all have our favorites, and some of them are guilty favorites. And people who watch the old public access cable show, I wasn't obsessed, but it was one of the gimmicks is that I was really obsessed with Curry Man.
Oh, okay.
If you don't know who Curry Man is, he was Christopher Daniels.
Right, yeah.
Who was an indie wrestler, did time with TNA. And it was just, you have fun with these guys that you just take a liking to. You go, I don't know who the heck this guy is, but I like him. Shinjiro Otani was one of the guys that I just really liked. The way he wrestled in the ring. And we could talk about that for hours and have nothing to do with history. And I'm fine doing that too. But I think that the purpose of this show, at least for now, is to walk us through the history of professional wrestling all the way from 1951 all the way through. There are some major angles that you need to know about, but I also want to tell you about the major players. It wasn't just Riki Dozan. He can't wrestle himself.
Right, absolutely, because that's the name we all hear, right? The godfather, the originator of Japanese professional wrestling, but who was he wrestling, right? So I'm looking forward to that. And I love that you'll not only be able to break down the language barrier here for us, tear the walls completely down on that, but you'll also be able to add context to everything. Like you said here, all of this behind-the-scenes stuff, you're able to translate a lot of information that a lot of people over here have never even seen, much less had the opportunity to translate. So I'm looking forward to all of that, whether we're talking about the JWA, Riki Dozan, the original Tokyo Pro back in the 60s, IWE, All Japan and New Japan breaking off around 72 or so. It's so much to talk about in the history. And I love that we have a starting point, too. It's not like, well, it kind of, I guess you could say it might have started here, or it may have started there, or people say this. We kind of have a starting point that we can actually go to, and so much talent to cover, and so many backstories and everything. I'm looking so much forward to everything you have to offer here, man.
I'm excited to talk about it. This stuff has been in my head for 30 years, and other than the public access show talking with my friend about it, I haven't had a chance to talk about it with too often, but it's still all in my head, and I still love it, and I still enjoy it, and I can't wait to get started with this journey through the history of Japanese professional wrestling.
My God, there's a treasure trove right now of files and information that Dan has allowed me. I feel very lucky to go over these files and read and research and learn along with everybody out there. And so I'm slightly prepared and I don't come off like a complete idiot as Dan takes us through the history here week after week. I think it's very important to at least explain the origins of pro wrestling in Japan. So I think that's probably a good starting point is the beginning.
Sounds good to me. 1951, and you've got a guy, Riki Dozan, who's interested in getting into wrestling, and we'll tell you why. There are reasons why he wants to get in professional wrestling, and he agrees, or he's able to be trained and do exhibition matches during a tour of American wrestlers in Japan. And after that, we move into the rest of the history, but that is the seed that grows into what we know now as Japanese wrestling.
And I've had some of the potential listeners, I can't call them listeners yet because we haven't had a show until now, but they've contacted me on Facebook. Hey, we got over 11,000 followers right now in the WrestleCopia brand on Facebook. So hey, keep them coming, guys. We're looking forward to getting more and more listeners here on the Puro Wrestling Academy in the weeks to come. Tell your friends they're about to learn a whole new world in pro wrestling here. But I'm going to be adding some videos from time to time over there on my YouTube channel, guys, youtube.com/wrestlinggrenade, because I've had a lot of people asking me, hey, when you guys talk about this or that, how are we able to kind of watch along? Now, some of this stuff is not going to cut the mustard. It just ain't going to make it to air on YouTube because legalities. I love that word. But we're going to try to throw some things up from time to time for people to enjoy some random rare things. And that's the plan right now. And the end goal, I hope it's the end goal anyway, the big plan and the long term is hopefully we can start doing something similar to what you did in the past, Dan. And that's video casts where people can essentially, well, you'll add the commentary, we'll add the context to historical Japanese wrestling matches and events, and they can kind of watch along with it as you give everybody the background.
That would be a treat for me. I did it for so long. I had so much fun doing it. And the idea of doing watch-alongs again, watching classic Japanese wrestling with virtual fans watching along with me. We'll get the files shared. We'll time it out. We'll synchronize and we'll start. And I'll just start yapping. It is a fun time. I guarantee you're going to have a good time and you might learn something. And you might be able to experience Japanese wrestling in a different way when you've got English commentary on top of it.
Absolutely. That's the end game, guys. That's the plan in the long run. But we're going to get things up and running first. And I feel like this is a pretty successful first episode. Kind of got to know who Dan was, his background, and as far as becoming a wrestling fan, how you got into the Japanese wrestling scene. And you spent more than 30 years studying this Japanese world of professional wrestling. And here we are today. So I'm looking forward to everything that's coming.
As am I, Ray.
Well, all right, guys. This was the Puro Wrestling Academy episode number. We're gonna call this one 0, right? This is not technically the first episode, is it?
No, correct. It's episode 0 because this is the introductory episode into the history. We only glossed over history. We're going to get deep into the study.
I love it.
Deep into class. Class will really be in session next episode.
I love it, guys. Stay tuned. We'll be back very shortly with episode number 1 coming here at Pro Wrestling Academy. And we hope you guys have enjoyed the very first edition, however. But when we return, come ready, guys, because as Dan said at the beginning of the show, class will most assuredly be in session. And I'm looking forward to it. Thank you once again, Dan. I can't wait.
Thank you very much as well.